Oh, fine. You know, you laughed the first time I did that.
They say you gotta end a party with a bang. Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus is the technically 8th major installment in the Ratchet and Clank series and marks the final installment in the Future Saga storyline. This was released back in November of 2013. I remember when I first heard about this game, and I was honestly pretty curious what exactly was going to happen from here. I mean, after all, I thought the end of A Crack in Time was pretty final, so I didn't really think we were going to get another game, and yet, surprisingly, here we are. Now, of course, this game isn't as long as A Crack in Time, but that doesn't mean that we can't have an awesome time exploring the galaxy again. So, where is this adventure going to lead us? Let's find out today, as I'm Ace, and this is Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus review. So, let's begin. This adventure takes place sometime after the events of Full Frontal Assault. Another aggravating mess that I don't really want to get into. Essentially, Ratchet and Clank are transporting a very dangerous criminal, Vendra Prague, to a remote prison to serve out their sentence. And Talon tells them to be very careful and to never approach her alone and bring Kronk and Zephyr, because Vendra happens to be the worst criminal that they've ever come across. Pure evil. But it's nothing like our dynamic duo hasn't already seen before. Things take a turn for the worse when her brother ends up breaking into the transport ship that they are using with his own personal army, the Thugs for Less, which we haven't seen since the events of Going Commando. Despite their best efforts, Vendra ends up breaking out of her prison and causes the ship to explode. While Ratchet and Clank are able to escape, Kronk and Zephyr unfortunately die in the process. This honestly breaks Talon's heart because they were her family. So seeing the last of her family just get neutralized hurts. And she doesn't want the same to happen to Ratchet and Clank if they decide to go after Vendra Prague, because to her, they're her family too. But Ratchet can't let Kronk and Zephyr's death go in vain, and he has to stop Vendra and her brother before they can cause any more damage. While tracking them down, they learn that they're essentially trying to recreate their own version of the Dimensionator. Now, if you don't remember what the Dimensionator was, it's a device that allows you to open portals to other dimensions and universes. It's essentially what the Lombaxes used to escape Emperor Tachyon's annihilation all the way back in the events of Tools of Destruction. Using this device, she calls to this creature, Mr. I, and plans to use it to open a portal to the Netherverse, allowing the Nethers to enter the Polaris galaxy. While they're able to stop Neftin Prague, Vendra arrives and subdues them. Vendra activates the Dimensionator and brings the Nethers into the Polaris galaxy. And, honestly, the surprise of no one, Mr. I has essentially been manipulating Vendra the entire time, as he was only using her to bring him and the rest of the Nethers into this new reality and traps her in a Netherverse. Now, before the Nethers can tear Ratchet and Clank limb from limb, Neftin Prague saves them because he needs them to get his sister back. And without Vendra, they're going to have no chance of trapping the Nethers back in the Netherverse. So they form a temporary alliance, with Neftin promising to turn himself in, along with his sister, to face up for their many crimes, including killing Kronk and Zephyr. The plan, essentially, is to get the original Dimensionator that's locked up in the Intergalactic Museum of History and fix it so that they can use that to send the Nethers back. After breaking into the Serum Museum and stealing the Dimensionator, the plan of attack begins. While Neftin, Pollux, one of the scientists that the Progs kidnapped to help them with their research, and Quark work on restoring the Dimensionator, Ratchet and Clank engage Mr. I to give them enough time to fix the Dimensionator. Clank also is able to locate Vendra in the Netherverse, which allows Neftin to open a portal to free her. And, using the rest of her power, Vendra is able to trap Mr. I and the rest of the Nethers back into the Netherverse, saving the galaxy once again. However, Vendra gets a little surprised when Neftin honestly accepts his punishment and escorts him and Vendra off to prison. Of course, Vendra hates this idea and tries to retaliate, but she doesn't really have any power left to do so. So, they're both sent away to prison. We fast forward a bit, with Clank and Ratchet just taking a nice breather after everything, and of course the Dimensionator is broken again.
I am sorry. That's okay. If the Dimensionator was functional, would you use it?
To find the Lombaxes? I don't know. There was a time I would have said yes, but at this point, there's more for me here than over there. Come on. We don't want to keep her waiting.
This was an interesting look at the universe of Ratchet and Clank. I honestly like the idea that Ratchet has essentially grown past the idea of trying to find the Lombaxes. I mean, I understand him wanting to find them before, but essentially as time has grown on, he's looked past the idea because he realizes he has a family here in the universe that he's in, and sure, it'd be nice to meet other people like him, but there's not really a quote-unquote family there, if that makes sense. I mean, his dad was killed by Kiana, his mom's dead. He doesn't really have any other relatives that we know of, so at least here he's got Clank, Talwyn, Quark, and all the other friends and allies that he's met across this game's franchise, so at least that he has people here that he can call family. The story of Vendra Prog and her brother is pretty interesting because in their own way they were just like Ratchet. At least Vendra, in her wanting to find the Nethers and wanting to do whatever it took to achieve something that they wanted so desperately. Honestly, I wonder what will happen to these characters. Will they return later on? I don't know. But, moving on, let's get to the gameplay. Gameplay for Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus is, pretty self-standard-like stuff that has been improved upon since a crack in time. But one thing you should know is that the game's definitely shorter. As where Into the Nexus probably had maybe about 20 planets or so. Into the Nexus has 4, and an extra one, which is the arena, which is just, so it's like, there's not as many planets. So you'll probably knock this out maybe about 4 or 5 hours at most, if that. Just a bit longer than Quest for Booty was. Now, something interesting I'd like to add with Into the Nexus has to be something interesting I'd like to add with Into the Nexus is the Clank sections. Clank essentially enters what would be considered like the Netherverse in tiny bits, where he uses essentially like gravity to manipulate himself through the level to send nethers into certain objects and places to allow Ratchet and Clank to explore further in the levels. And honestly, I think this is pretty cool. We've been so used to having Clank sections where they've essentially just been leading gadget bots down tunnels over and over again. And while I'm fine with those, I like that there's at least more variety of things for him to do instead of just that. Same with why I liked the whole time manipulation in A Crack in Time. The weapons this time around are okay, but again, it suffers from that same dilemma of, oh, repeating weapons from an installment prior. Which unfortunately kind of sucks, but I think for this one I'm fine with it because this is also a very short adventure, so I'm not expecting like a super full arsenal of the craziest unique stuff here, as if it was like Into the Nexus. I mean, not Into the Nexus. I think the weapons in this game are okay, but again, they suffer from that same problem of some of them are weapons that have already been shown prior in a previous game, as some of these weapons were in Full Frontal Assault as well, or earlier. Now, they do require less work to level them all the way up to max, so I think that balances it out, especially because, again, this is a short game, so going to like level 5 or level 10 may just be a bit excessive. They also essentially bring back the jetpack, but more in the sense of like you being able to hover through levels as long as you have the fuel to actually use it. So similar to what was going on in Going Commando all those years ago. I think that's cool, but essentially we've lost the jetpack as just a regular mode of transportation, and we're back with the helipad, which I honestly just thought that the jetpack looked cooler, but that's not really that big of a problem. As for something I did find interesting, the Rhino this time around. Now, I'm sure you guys know, Rhino is usually the best weapon in the game. But something interesting this time around is the Rhino isn't as overpowered as I thought it was going to be. For example, at level 1 with the Rhino, I took the weapon against the final boss, and I honestly ran out of ammo before I even made it to the second phase of that fight. Which, honestly, is pretty silly when I think about it, because if we were talking about the Rhino from past games at least, yes, even that horrid size matters, the Rhino would have at least done a lot better, even getting down to half, or at least taking it out in one go. But level 1 Rhino just was not capable of the drop. Now, I think the easy thing to think about is, you know, you could have just leveled it up to max. But the thing is, usually I wouldn't have to, though. Usually you'd be able to just blitz it without having to even level it up to max, because that's just how good the Rhino was. Now, maybe they just didn't want you to do that, so they had to tone it down a bit, so it'd make you try and use the other weapons. Which, if that's the case, that's an interesting thing to think about, because isn't this supposed to be the best weapon in the universe? If not, then maybe I don't understand. Alright, now let's get to characters wise. Honestly, when it comes to characters, there's the only ones I really want to focus on are Ratchet and the Prague twins. Ratchet has honestly done a bit of growth, I should say. You know, in Tools of Destruction, he was so willing to try and get to the Dimensionator to use it to find the Lombaxes, but now he seems to have essentially matured and grown, as in his eyes now, the Dimensionator is kind of just not a priority anymore. He's come to the ideal that he doesn't need it because what he would consider his own family is here in this galaxy. You know, Clank, Talon, to an extension Quark, and all the other friends that he's made here would be what his family would be. As, to be fair, with the rest of the Lombaxes, he doesn't really have a family, so to speak. You know, both his parents are dead. And even someone he would consider family, you know, like Azimuth, he died in the last game. So there's really nothing. Sure, he could make a new family, but he'd also be leaving the family he's known behind. So he's come to realize that maybe he doesn't need to go. But I do like the idea that Clank at least still wants to try and help him find the Lombaxes. Although, we won't be finding out about that until the next game. I do like the Progs, though. Vendra is a cool villain. And, again, she has a similar motivation. She wants to be able to find the Nethers, as she considered them her family, just like her brother. And is willing to go to whatever lengths to get them back. Now, of course, I hate the fact that she essentially gets sidelined after bringing the Progs here, because the actual, now I hate the fact that she gets sidelined as the main villain by the real leader of the Nethers, because you don't even get the leader of the Nethers to talk. It's just incoherent noise. And I'm like, if this was such a big presence that the rest of the Nethers followed behind their command, in Vendra and her brother, you could have at least went the extra mile to give him a voice or their own plan or thoughts, but we don't really have anything other than he just wants to destroy. Now, Neft in Prague, honestly, the guy has a lot of growth. Sure, he's bad, but at the end of the day, he cared about his own sister's safety more than anything else. And I gotta give him some props. The man held up his word that he would take them both to prison should he and the others be able to stop the Nethers. If this was like any other villain, they probably would have tried to go back on the deal and be like, sucker, or this. So, I gotta hand it to him. He's a man of his word. Not many others would do that. Now, as always, there'd be things I'd like to talk about, whether the good or the bad with these games. Again, something I would at least consider bad is it's just short. Now, again, this isn't as short as Quest for Booty, but it's still a short game, and I wish that there was at least a few more hours in this, or at least a few more planets to explore. Like, what makes these games always such a blast is because there's so many fun places to explore, new weapons to get, enemies to fight, but when the game is as short as it is, and all you usually get to see are sort of the same similar type of enemies. Kind of takes a little bit of the fun out of it. Like, will I still definitely play this over something like Secret Agent Clank or Seismic? Oh, absolutely. But I just makes me remember, I wish there was just more to it. The other thing I don't like about this game is essentially the real villain, the leader of the Nethers, Mr. I, because I feel like they could have made him a cooler villain than just a like giant monster. I mean, you could tell that it at least has some intellect to be able to converse with the Progs to try and help build the Dimensionator to bring the Nethers to this dimension, but we don't really get to hear any of that, as it's literally just a lot of incomprehensible noise whenever they so it's like we don't really get to know their like or what their plan was. But more importantly, I would have liked if Vendra had ended up becoming the one controlling the show. I would have loved to have faced her instead. And it would have made her brother trying to help us a bit more impactful in my eyes, because let's say if she absorbed the leader of the Nether's power and started to go out of control, and Neptune would have asked for Ratchet's help to get her back to I would have loved that just a bit more than what we have here. But I guess that's just more a what-if type of story. But hey. The worst weapon the last thing I'd like to talk about is the Winterizer. The Winterizer is essentially, it's a weapon that turns your enemies into snowmen. Now, this is essentially similar to the Sheepinator, the Duckinator from Up Your Arsenal, you know, that kind of thing, turning your enemies into other animals or objects. And honestly, what I don't like about it is it just kind of takes the longest time to upgrade. And especially when you're in New Game Plus and you're trying to do all this stuff for Platinum by maxing out everything. Going through them all, this was probably the worst. I mean, sure, there's a Nightmare Box, which is a similar problem, but I just found using that to be at least a bit more useful in the grand scheme of things, even if it does take a long to level up as well. And there's also the problem of, let's say if you get hit in the midst of transforming your enemy into another animal or object, then you have to kind of start the whole process again. Now, that's a problem that these weapons have kind of had. So it's like, it's not just this version, but it just kind of reminds me why I don't tend to use these as much as the others. They're fun, but in the heat of a firefight, maybe not what you want to go for. Into the Nexus was an interesting little adventure, and it marks the end of the Ratchet and Clank Future saga. And overall, I think it puts a nice little bow on the adventure, as not just for the Future series, but as well as for the PlayStation 3 era. And it was nice to be able to come back to this game once again and give it a look over. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, and if there's something I miss or talk about, you know, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. We got one more game on the main line that we need to talk about, and honestly, it's going to be a blast replaying through this Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. So whenever that part comes out next, I hope you're ready. Till then, I've been Ace. Thanks for joining us. See you later. Bye-bye, and have a great day.